When you think of baseball in the late 1980s, what
That's
do you
this one
think
toward
of?
Johnson. The play is home. Got him. Sour between those two.
I think of
Ground
artificial
ball
turf.
toward Smith. It's short. Backhanded play. Double play. What a double play turn by the Cardinals. 2 out.
And video games. And of course, I think of baseball cards. Yeah, the late 80s, the early 90s, the junk wax era. Do you remember that? So for some of us, this was the golden age of baseball cards. And the reason why is because you could buy baseball cards literally everywhere you went. Every single store had them. I'm not even kidding about that. Well, collectors scoff at anybody interested in collecting cards from the junk wax era, of course. And everybody knows that these sets were printed to oblivion. And of course, some of the more interesting card design choices also make it a pretty poor investment choice. But have you ever wondered why we had the junk wax era to begin with? Why it is the baseball card companies decided to start printing millions of copies of every single card? And are any of the cards worth collecting, or are they all just a waste of time? And most importantly, is there a way that we can figure out if we're in this type of over-exuberant market today and something like Magic the Gathering cards or video games or something like that? Well, that's what we're going to dive into today. First of all, though, we've got to understand the history of baseball cards to understand the junk wax era. So let's go back to the 1950s. As you probably know, the true golden age of baseball cards was the early 1950s. The competition between Topps and Bowman gave us some of the most beautiful baseball card sets in the history of the hobby. Even the card backs looked absolutely gorgeous. In retrospect, it is really impressive that these companies put this much time and effort into creating cards for children. Now, I really need to emphasize that last point, by the way. These cards were created for child collectors. It was a children's toy. This was never created for the intention of having like adults collect a whole bunch of them and hoard them all. In fact, if you were a collector of baseball cards in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, or even 60s, and there were collectors out there, if you were one of them, people would think that you were totally eccentric and bizarre. So for example, this famous article from the Syracuse Herald Journal in December 1955 is largely the first time a major media outlet reported on baseball card collecting. It's not the most flattering picture of Jefferson Burdick, who's the man who created the first American card catalog. And it's interesting to note that the T206 Honus Wagner is specifically mentioned in this article with an estimated auction value of $50. Even into the mid-1960s, collecting cards was such a peculiar passion that collectors like this man inspired newspaper reporting. The hobby was still seen largely as a harmless pastime for children. Well, that all slowly started to change, especially as kids who remembered the glory days of cards in the early 1950s. When those kids started to grow up and get jobs and have money, they started to want to buy the cards. So this is around the time in the 70s where you start hearing people complain about how their mothers threw out their card collections when they were kids. And you started to see people travel throughout the United States in order to buy collections of cards from strangers. Back in those days, you really had to look hard to find the people who sold baseball cards outside of packs, like this small ad from the April 11th, 1962 issue of the Sporting News. Even then, most of the cards that were advertised were recent sets. There wasn't much by way of vintage product. Of course, if you look hard enough, you'll probably come across advertisements for some other old favorites as well. By 1975, that had changed to the point where multiple companies were advertising full sets. That is also around when we saw the first baseball card hobby publications. And of course, that's when the era of baseball card conventions first began. So my understanding is that what happened back then is a lot of these small conventions would take place in little towns up and down the Midwest. So what would happen is the big collectors would come show up, they would set up the convention, and at the convention they would buy tons of old cards from people who happened to still have them like in their attics or in their basement or their crawl space or whatever. Now, a lot of these people who were selling their cards probably had no idea that anybody actually would want to buy this stuff, right? Remember, this was treated as some kind of child's toy. Now, there's a clear sign here that demand for these cards was high and it was growing. And that demand is what led to the prices increasing. Because remember, the supply is already like set. Topps wasn't printing any new cards, for example. Anyway, that increase in price is what attracted a lot of media attention to the hobby. This 1977 Time magazine article on baseball cards was among the first mainstream press pieces to really call attention to the investment part of the hobby. The most notable parts of the article are the mentions of high prices for the so-called stumper cards, as well as this direct comparison with the stock market. While it might have looked like kid stuff at the time, the money they were talking about was already big business money. The real kicker, though, was this 1979 article in the Wall Street Journal, which made it clear that the hobby was now all about the big bucks. And I believe this article is the first to mention the sudden escalation in price for the 1952 Topps Mickey Mantle. Ah yeah, the 1952 Mantle. So if you're my age, maybe a little bit older, you think of that card as the most famous card in the entire hobby. I mean, like, kids my age, right, like we would do nothing but think about this card all day long. Right, so this stockbroker in 1979 estimated that, what did he say, it'd be worth like about $1,200 at the time. Well, you know, just a couple years later, even after the so-called Mr. Mint discovery of like 80 or so uncirculated copies of this card in mint condition in 1986, the value kept moving up. We're talking up to like 5 figures or so, like 20 grand for a card. These days, the most recent auction price for that 1952 Topps Mantle in PSA 9 condition hit almost $3 million. And that's after the total collapse of the hobby in the 1990s. So the funny thing, of course, is that the 1952 Topps Mantle is not really Mantle's rookie card. Mantle's real rookie card is this 1951 Bowman card, which doesn't command nearly as much money. Bowman also printed a 1952 card for Mantle, which I honestly think looks a little bit better than the Topps card. But it's the scarcity of the 1952 Topps High Series cards, along with Mantle's obvious notoriety, that made this card so valuable. Yeah, scarcity. So like I said before, this is totally a story of supply and demand. But in the early 1980s, nobody was paying any attention to this, right? They didn't look at what the supply of cards was like. All they could see is price goes up. So since price goes up for old card, price must go up for new card, right? There was this like bizarre concept that the Mantle card was worth a lot because it was his rookie card. That's the start of the rookie phenomenon, which lasts to this day, and which, when you think about it, doesn't really make any sense. I mean, this whole idea had this bizarre impact on the hobby. So in mid-1980, the Los Angeles Times printed this article about how baseball cards were as good as gold. The message was clear: the market is up, which apparently means that it's the ideal time to buy. The next season, 1981, was the first year of Fernando Mania, of course. Valenzuela was hugely popular, and he looked like he was going to be a great pitcher for years to come. Now, 1981 was also the year that the Topps monopoly on new cards was finally broken. Fleer had finally been successful in its lawsuit against Topps, which had lasted well over a decade, and a company called Donruss also entered the market at the same time. That meant that there were more cards on the market than ever before. So that's a good thing if you're a customer, right? Because you get more choice. But it also means that there was more hype on the market than ever before because there were all these new sets, right? And there's new product out there. And every set's got the hot rookie. And everybody wants to get the hot rookie because, of course, everybody knew that today's young superstar would always be the next 1952 Mantle. The increase in demand led to the establishment of baseball card stores, which was a new phenomenon. You started to see more and more baseball card conventions being held around the country. And the influx of new people into the hobby caused the companies to print more product to meet the demand. The crazy thing of all is that you can still buy unopened cases of product from this era. There's just so much of this stuff out there. So I'll put it this way. If you're younger than like 40 or so, you have no idea how much demand there actually was for baseball cards back in those days. Everybody had them. Every single friend that I grew up with had baseball cards. I've met girls who had baseball cards. I don't even know how they got them, right? And you got so many of these stupid cards that it felt like the cards would breed when you let them alone, right? I swear, I still find every time I open up like my old closet and look at my old cards, I find that there are new 1990 Topps cards there that I didn't know that I had, right? Now, these cards were referenced in mainstream television shows. Famously, for example, there's an episode of Home Improvement that's all about how, the kids buy like, a toy Indy race car or something instead of doing the wise thing and putting their money into baseball cards. I mean, it's bizarre to look at today, but that's what it was like at the time. There were investing publications that routinely published articles about the baseball card industry. I'm talking like Wall Street type publications. So it seemed that these cards were a can't miss investment. And the idea was always that today's set would be tomorrow's 1952 Topps. It was totally insane. Now, it's not hard to see that the cards from the 1980s were not exactly like the great cards from the 1950s. In other words, the problem with the junk wax era cards isn't just the oversupply. The cards also look bad, and they were printed on pretty crappy cardstock as well. In fact, I swear that there are whole years of Topps cards where you simply cannot read the back. The color choices were just horrible. Compare that to the famous card backs of the early 1950s, and you'll understand why collectors will always stay away from junk wax. So of course, this was not going to last forever. And guess what? It didn't last forever. In fact, the market bottomed out not long after Upper Deck entered. The 1989 Upper Deck set is one of the most famous baseball card sets of all time. In all honesty, it's probably the best of the junk wax era sets. You got the clean presentation, emphasis on action photos, the anti-counterfeiting technology, the whiteness of the borders and all that stuff. It was just revolutionary. And of course, the cards were sold in foil packs, not wax, which eliminated the practice of resealing. So back in those days, Upper Deck's tagline was the collector's choice. And the truth is that they put a lot of time and a lot of effort into doing things that they figured would make customers or collectors happy. For example, they put these holograms on cards because it was really hard to fake those, right? That was supposed to stop people from making bootleg copies of the cards. Never mind the fact that these early Upper Deck sets had like millions of copies of every single card printed, right? They also put a lot of these cards, like I just said, in foil packs, making it harder for people to open up the pack, take the good cards out, and then reseal them, which is something that was very, very common before this started, right? The thing is, though, that even Upper Deck could not avoid this like industry-wide practice of just printing everything to the ground. 1990 Upper Deck looks nice, sure, but these cards are totally worthless. By 1991, Topps came out with its Stadium Club set, which was a high-end product that was designed to compete directly with Upper Deck. The 1991 Topps base set was also designed to look cleaner. And by 1992, Topps had improved the look of the back of the card to try to match what Upper Deck was doing. And the other thing is that around that time, we saw a lot more sets created by a lot more companies that had never been in the market before. So the truth is that the decline in the baseball card industry actually started before the 1994 strike. I would argue it started as early as 1991. The reason was really simple. It's that the market was oversaturated with product, and all the product looked basically the same. Even the high quality product looked essentially the same from one company to the next. People just couldn't keep up with it, and all of a sudden collecting was just not fun anymore. That's not to say that all the sets look bad, of course. I will always love these Fleer Ultra cards, for example. In 1994 Topps is one of my all-time favorite sets. I really love this design. But the supply of these cards is just way too high for any serious like investing. And by 1995, baseball card shops were closing up left and right. Alright, so this is the part that nobody talks about these days. And trust me, I've done the Google searches, I've looked around, nobody's talking about this fact. So I'm gonna say it. The truth is that the Players Association's war fund, for the 1994 strike, that came largely from the proceeds from baseball cards. That's the thing. If you wanted to print baseball cards then, you had to have an agreement with the Players Association. It wasn't like Topps back in the 1950s where you paid like $5 to each player and they were happy, right? We're talking a whole ton of money you had to pay, a whole bunch of it up front. That money went straight into the war fund. Right? People knew this back then, especially in late 94 and early 95, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The industry has never recovered from this. Anyway, that's the story of what happened, but there's a bigger question, which is any of this stuff worth collecting at all? Some of it's worth collecting, most of it's not. As always, if you want to collect, you should consider buying something that you really like. And remember, this isn't like investment advice, this is just my opinion. So if you are thinking about investing, you might want to stay away from like the really overprinted stuff, like 1988 Topps. Now, it might be worth looking into parallel sets like the 1991 Topps Baseball Desert Shield, though I would be very careful. It is a notoriously rare set, yeah, but it's just 1991 Topps with a stamp, and there are a ton of counterfeits out there. Instead, I would recommend looking into something like the Topps Tiffany sets, which are actually limited and really not easy to find. Tiffany cards are glossy and have a much higher quality finish, and you can usually tell them apart because the backs are actually clean and, readable. So Topps ended the Tiffany parallel set in, I think it's 1992. It's when Topps went for Topps Gold instead, which were inserts. The thing about Topps Gold is that they couldn't resist overprinting all that stuff. The Topps Gold was overprinted, Topps Black Gold was overprinted. All of that stuff that Topps tried, like ever since Tiffany, was overprinted. I mean, everything is, right? You see, the thing is that back in those days, those companies could not stop themselves from printing like 1 million copies of every single thing that they had. The money just seemed to be too easy for them to make because of the insane, overly passionate exuberance that everybody who was buying these cards had. Even when the industry was in a downturn in like 94 and 95, they still overprinted. So that brings me to my next question, which is, could people have known at the time that they were in a bubble? I would argue that they could have seen the signs as early as the late 1970s. So that Time magazine article was great if you were a seller, sure. However, the extra attention being paid to the industry by Wall Street was very, very dangerous. Articles like this one from a rural Illinois paper in 1984 were a dime a dozen those days. And the promise of potential huge rewards will always be too eye-catching for ordinary people to ignore. So the thing is, and you have to understand this, that the real problem here was not the increased demand for vintage cards. Like, when I'm talking about these 1950s cards and people wanting to buy that stuff up, the fact that people were interested in that didn't cause the industry to collapse. No, the thing is that the problem is that there was a corresponding increase for today's cards, right? Something that made absolutely no sense. And we're not just talking about people saying, oh, baseball cards are cool, or this card looks neat, maybe I'm going to go buy a pack. Now, I'm talking like people buying cases of these cards, right? I'm talking about people wanting an alternative to their 401k so they don't put any money into their retirement fund, and instead all of that money goes towards buying case after case of sealed product that goes into their closet, and that today you can find on eBay. And right now on eBay, it's at inflated prices, right? You can probably talk these prices down to half what they actually are, and still you're probably not hitting market value, right? That's what I'm talking about, right? The mania that was here was based entirely on the perceived future value of the product. So what does that mean? That means that we're not going to be a bag holder long term. Instead, we're going to hold the bag for a little while until we find a bigger sucker than us to pass this off to, right? That's the mindset that you're talking about. That's what the problem really was. So these days, if you're talking about stuff like Magic the Gathering cards, the increase in demand alone does not necessarily mean that you're in a bubble. And similarly, the fact that there are these one-of-one serial cards doesn't necessarily mean that the market is going to fall apart tomorrow. Now, the problem is when you see people in the mainstream media talk about treating your collecting hobby as an alternative to the stock market. That's what you have to watch out for. And note here that the suggestion was to buy a complete set of cards instead of just a pack. That's a trend that led companies to print increasingly high numbers of sets of cards, which is where the oversupply came from. Now, I'll be really blunt here. I do not think that we're to that point in Magic the Gathering or in modern sports cards or in video game collecting or whatever. Now, I can't give you like financial advice, right? All I can give is my opinion, and everything I've said here is really just my opinion. But I still would stay away from investing in something like sealed product. And I do think that these artificially limited serial cards, the 1 of 1, 1 of 10, 1 of 50 or whatever, I think that that's extremely risky in the long run. The reason why I say that is because the long-term history of collecting baseball cards shows that people like to have full sets. They like to have maybe, a nice looking card or a set that looks nice. There's no evidence out there that people like to get very, very, minor variants of this card and that card, unless there's like some actual value, like a different colored back or something like that. The 1 of 1, 1 of 5, 1 of 10, I really think that that's a trap. That's just my opinion. Maybe you think differently, right? Seriously though, even if you include this stuff, it's still nothing like it was in the 1980s, right? And you need to understand that. Now, cryptocurrency, that looks a lot more like baseball cards looked in the 1980s. That's another topic probably for another channel. Anyway, that's my take here on the subject. Let me know what you think down in the comments, whether you agree or disagree, and I'll talk with you again later.